Truth be told is that this context has often buffaloed a lot of commentators, and a lot of it stems around one's eschatology and angelology. But what I will say is that it's not that hard when you diagram the events out verse by verse, starting with that verses 2 and 5 clearly deal with Jesus' birth. The woman is pregnant and bears a man-child that is to rule the world. This is definitely about Jesus because before and after this, we know Jesus is the one to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Then, verse 5 finishes saying that the child was caught up unto God to sit on his throne. This is clearly describing Jesus' ascension after his resurrection. So, we have 3 clear historical points laid out to work from here, and more importantly, we know where Jesus is located in all of these. Ooh, I bet you might already know where I'm going to go with this. Now look at verse 6. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Long story short is that the woman represents faithful Israel. It's not about Mary. Mary is obviously the chosen woman in the Nativity story to bring forth the Messiah. But here, this is about faithful Israel. There's no point in the Bible or any other church writing where Mary goes and flees into the wilderness for 3.5 years. And John is clearly grabbing this from Isaiah 66, 7 through 8, where Zion is the one who brings forth the man-child. Now, what about verses 1, 3, and 4? Well, verse 1 is celestial language that uses the Virgo constellation in association with Jesus' conception and birth from a virgin. So, there are no new events to chart here. Now, verses 3 and 4. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now I'm sure everyone has been taught, or has heard, that this is the description that describes 1/3 of the angels rebelling with Satan prior to Adam and Eve's fall. I'm sorry, but that is simply not biblically accurate. That is simply a church tradition passed on because nothing in this context alludes to pre-creation or pre-fall contexts or worlds. What it does have is a clear connection to Jesus' birth, saying that the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And this matches Herod's massacre of the innocent in his attempt to kill the King of the Jews, Jesus Christ. And this makes a lot of sense since verses 3 and 4 come between 2 and 5. There's zero reason to rewind the clock back at verses 3 and 4 to pre-fall times in the text. Again, that is church tradition, yanking it out of context and applying it to a story that nowhere else in the Bible describes such an event of 1/3 of angels rebelling in a pre-flood world or pre-fall world with Satan. This is the only place in the entire Bible where 1/3 and angels are used in association with each other. But most know that 1/3 is used a lot with things that are said to be destroyed or killed in Revelation chapters 8 and 9. This is another clue that we should not remove 12:4 away from Revelation's context, which is in verse 3 describes the dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and this is connected to the beast who has 7 heads and 10 horns that chapter 17 picks up on as well. And I really hope that everyone knows that the 10 horns is Daniel 7 language of the fourth empire, whereas the 7 heads are the previous empires conglomerated together into the fourth beast, as Revelation 13:2 describes the fourth beast having the previous beast's attributes. The bottom line is that Rome is the fourth empire as stated from Josephus, John, and Jesus. There's just no way of getting around it other than simply by avoiding the text, the context, and recorded history of 4 successive empires from starting with Babylonians down to Rome. So, verses 3 and 4 events are tied to the same period in time, that of with Jesus' birth. Now, you're likely asking, what does verse 4 describe then about the dragon sweeping a third of the stars and casting them to the earth if it's not that rebellion story that I've always believed in? Well, it's really not that hard to understand when you take a look at both verbs in other verses in the New Testament. Saru is used 5 times in the New Testament, and the other time by John in John 21:8, with the apostles dragging the net filled with fishes back to the shore. Did the fish want to get dragged to the shore? No. And the point here is that we see a forceful act being done by one party to another. The 3 other places are all found in Acts. Acts 8 with Saul persecuting the church. Acts 14 with Paul being stoned nearly to death and him being dragged out of the city and left for dead. And Acts 17 with some Jews attacking Jason's house and bringing Jason and other believers before the rulers of the city. Each of these contexts were clear description of a forceful attack by one party against the other one, which takes us to our second word, balo. This should be familiar and easy with Revelation 2:10, saying that the devil is going to cast some in the Smyrna church into prison. Or about how Jesus says that he will cast Jezebel and others with her into great tribulation. The action is clearly forceful in both verses. And guess what? Balo comes up a lot in Revelation 12 with Satan and his angels being casted out of heaven and into the earth in verse 9. So, all 3 words conclusively show that Satan is the one on the assault here against the stars of heaven. And if you're still needing one more proof that I'm right about this, is that Revelation 12:4 is reminiscent of Daniel 8:10's little horn that is said to cast some of the host and of the stars to the ground. So, the description here is Satan having a war in heaven and successfully beating down a third of the good angels in heaven to earth. Well, geez, why does that sound so familiar to that of verse 7's war in heaven? It's because verse 4 and 7 are parallel accounts of the same event. And even though Satan and his angels could defeat a third of the good angels in this war, is that is far from a majority, which is why verse 8 says that they prevailed not, and verse 9 explains their expulsion from heaven to earth. Now, what confirms this is that verses 4 and 7 are parallel accounts, is the time reference in verse 6 for 1,260 days. This describes the woman, i.e. Israel, fleeing into the wilderness where God protects and nourishes her there. But guess what? We have the exact same description in verse 14. And both of these are equal to 3.5 years with a time, times, and half a time coming from Daniel 7:25's little horn of the fourth empire that gets tagged to 1,290 days in Daniel 12:11, whereas John referred to the same period 2 times as 42 months and 2 times as 1,260 days, all of which are referring to 3.5 years. And there is zero reason to convert the days into years using the day-year formula SDAs. When Daniel and John express the same length in days, months, and years, and use the term phrase times referring to the one normal calendrical year, is that there is zero basis for doing anything more with the numbers. Stop fiddling with the authors that God chose to use to write his inspired work. So, since verses 6 and 14 parallel one another, then so do verses 4 and 7, which means that the war in heaven between Michael and Satan took place while Jesus was on the earth. And this provides us with the reason for Michael being described as fighting with his angels, as he was left in charge of the heavenly army once Jesus became incarnate on earth. This definitively shows that Michael and Jesus are 2 completely different beings. So, to all the equators out there, it's time to expunge this bad teaching that you have bought into for far too long. Reminder, hit the subscribe button below, turn on the notification bell, hit the like button, and leave a comment. And don't forget to visit us at justscripture.org. But in the meantime, stay salty.